So thank you all for joining me today. This is our next session on asking different questions, project funded by the National Science Foundation and run by the Feminist Research Institute. Today's session is called Making More Accurate Knowledge, Accounting for the Messiness of Science. Another way of saying what today's session is about is essentially thinking more deeply about objectivity and thinking more deeply about how objectivity actually operates in science, in reality, as opposed to an ideal. So in many ways, this is a session that a lot of the previous ones, if you've been with us, kind of builds up to. And so you'll see some recurring themes on topics we've talked about before. So just a reminder that the Feminist Research Institute is working to build more just futures through leadership, inquiry, and collaboration. And this project, Asking Different Questions, is a direct result of that. This project is designed to provide the intellectual foundations for justice-oriented STEM research by bringing insights from feminist science, technology studies, and critical race theory into applied uses for STEM researchers. Okay, so our agenda for today, we will start off with some foundational concepts. I'll introduce some general introduction to the topic. I will share some traits of objectivity and an alternative that is based in feminist science studies. And finally end with some discussion questions and closing. So this unit is one of all of them, probably the one that's going to get, we'll say, like the most academic-y. In terms of we're really going to be moving into some terminology and some frameworks that are really core to feminist science studies. And so just keep that in mind. There's going to be a lot. One of my favorite feminist science studies authors and scholars is Donna Haraway. If the first time you read Donna Haraway, it's sort of like being in a poem where you're not quite sure always like what's going on. And you kind of just like grasp onto the ideas that make sense. And that's actually part of the beauty of it, is the more you read it, the more you get out of it. And I'm not going to say that, this presentation is a poem by any means. But what I would advise you to as we go through is to grab onto the pieces that make sense. And if something is kind of, not resonating with you so much, that's fine. It's more in this presentation about finding something that you feel like you can work with rather than understanding the whole. Okay, so I want to start off by just giving a little bit of historical background about the term objectivity, sort of our central theme for this lesson. Over history, objectivity has actually changed in terms of its definition, and it often has many different definitions within science today. Originally, objectivity was often used as a way of describing a representation of an ideal form. In other words, a quote unquote like perfect specimen. Think of like those old botany books you may have seen with beautiful drawings of florals and whatnot. Those were all geared towards finding the objective perfect specimen, which obviously is far from the typical specimen. With the invention of photography, objectivity shifted its definition to be a visual record. And so objectivity often meant something that was photographed, recorded. That was the most objective sort of site of evidence. Objectivity shifts to become a trained observer. So here we are seeing the rise of scientific expertise. To truly be objective, you have to be trained. A really simple way of thinking about this could be like wine tasting. To be a good objective wine taster, you actually have to develop a palate. It is not something that just anyone has. And finally, objectivity comes to mean standardization. Here we can think of model organisms bred for research purposes. These again, obviously these are used for very specific reasons, and they are not necessarily representative of all reality, as we know. So I bring this up just to show that objective, the sort of something that is a very foundation of science and is extremely important, has also shifted in its meaning over time. It is far from static. And even in these lists, even in these four examples I've just given, objectivity is often very tied to power. And we can think of power as who has autonomy and authority, and how is it exercised over other. I think this is most clear in the example of expertise. If you can only be objective, you have a certain expertise. There's obviously quite a significant power dynamic built into that. And finally, these are sort of the last two most jargony terms I'll use. We have epistemology and ontology. Epistemology, most simply, we can think about this as like meaning, and ontology is material. So like meaning is like how we describe something, perhaps ontology would be the actual thing it is. These are often described as like separate things, but a really large body of feminist STS research demonstrates how these two things are constantly impacting each other. Think, for example, of the concept of obesity. That's an epistemological concept that refers to an ontological phenomenon. So body weight to height proportions or other physical phenomena is like a material thing. But if someone is labeled obese, this impacts the material, how people may change, how people may treat themselves, other people may treat them differently. This may impact their stress hormones. In fact, the whole point of giving something this definition of obese is to change the material. And so, I'll pause to say, like, the definition of obesity is actually has a lot of limitations and problems. We won't talk about that right now, but since I bring it up, I want to at least flag that. Okay, so what I'm going to now do is offer you 4 critiques of traditional objectivity, which you see on the left-hand side, which are the sort of traditional ways of thinking about objectivity, and then 4 alternatives. And these 4 alternatives are emerging from feminist science studies. So as I said, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. And what I would like you all to do is ideally take some notes as you go so you can remember which is which, but really the goal is to pick one. So if there's one that I talk about and you're just kind of like, okay, that's not resonating with me, don't worry about it. But if you hear one that sounds very interesting, remember which one that is. Okay, so aperspectivity. So the idea of aperspectivity is like in this photo. It's imagining as if you can see things from no particular position, as if we occupy a sort of a position in the sky apart from the phenomena we study. And this is supposed to imply that we don't have any presuppositions or any biases, that our beliefs are not necessarily influencing what we do. Feminists have called this a view from nowhere, or Donna Haraway calls it a God trick, as if we are trying to sort of like play God, as if we can be above. In reality, this is not an actual practical position that any of us actually engage in our research, that biases are actually necessary to do any theorizing for our work whatsoever. And so we should not necessarily be giving up our biases or our presuppositions, but actually noticing which ones are most fruitful and which ones are more misleading. So instead, feminist science studies propose this concept of partial perspectivity or partial perspective. This has also been called strong objectivity. It goes by other names, but in all of these ideas, what we see is the idea that from the place from which you are looking at your knowledge impacts the type of knowledge you receive. And so this is important because all of the images in this picture are the same thing. If you're at UC Davis, you'll recognize that as one of the eggheads that is outside of the library. However, all of these pictures obviously look immensely different. And photo credit to Maya Cruz, by the way. Thank you, Maya, for taking these images. So similarly, this applies not just to like the sort of literal tools we were using, which I imagine we can all see, but also the life experiences and position we have in the world. This will shape how we see problems, what we think are the most important questions, and the ways we interpret the information we receive. And feminist theorists argue that recognizing this truth and seeing the benefits in it may lead to fairer treatment of your data and richer and more robust and diverse research agendas. So if you actually acknowledge the position that you're coming from, you actually will produce better research than pretending that you have no position. Obviously, this goes, I should say, against many scientific norms. And so the way to do that, in which, is worth talking about. I kind of want to offer this quote. Objectivity turns out to be about a particular and specific embodiment. In other words, like, being a person in the world, and definitely not about the false vision promised by transcendence of all limits and responsibility. The moral is simple. Only partial perspective promises objective vision. So she's sort of like turning things on their head. Okay, so that's our first pair, aperspectivity and partial perspective. Now we're moving on to scientific detachment and emotional engagement. So scientific detachment, this is the idea that as scientists, we should be emotionally distanced from our object of study, that this distance is necessary to prevent any sort of like projected errors. Now, this again is something that is often thought of as an ideal, but is not necessarily reflective of reality. If we all think about our own engagement with science, and really virtually anyone we know, chances are there is some emotional attachment to what we're doing. We are motivated to do something in the world. And in fact, that actually is a site of power. That is a site from which we can actually produce better research. Therefore, feminist researchers propose instead a model of emotional engagement, that recognizing the way that we are attached to our objects of study. This is a really adorable picture of axolotl from Crystal Rogers' lab at UC Davis. She posts really wonderful pictures on her Twitter account of her research friends. And to me, this is a really great example, because the really clear care that Dr. Rogers has for her axolotl influences the research she does. It likely fosters a better sense of care for the creatures, to notice them with greater detail and depth than perhaps if we had a sort of like separation from these creatures. And this is true even when we're not studying, particularly like live animals. This may be true about like particular passion for rock formation, for land, for a particular change we want to see. But the point is, in all of these cases, acknowledging the emotion that we have in our science and thinking about that as a site of strength from which to do our work ultimately can produce more responsible knowledge. So you can see how the last example I gave contrasts with this next two pairing. Now we're moving on from detachment and emotional engagement to value neutrality and change-oriented research. So value neutrality. This is the idea that that scientists should not necessarily have any particular value or orientation to change in their research. And again, this is a way to avoid wishful thinking, political motivation, ideological reasonings. And so we are literally just sort of like observing phenomenon. We do not have any sort of desire for a particular outcome, moving in a particular direction. Again, this is another stance that is unrealistic and actually can be deceptive, because I think we all recognize there is a desire for change. There is a desire for some sort of results, perhaps one set of results over the other. And when we imagine scientists as truly neutral, this actually blocks the way that we can recognize how values and a desire for change can impact our work. This could be as pragmatic as feeling as if you need to have a particular result in order to secure further funding, or it could be, a particular sort of broader change that you want to be able to enact in the world. In either case, there is a sort of desire. You are not necessarily a neutral party in your research. So instead, feminist science studies scholars propose that we should think about change-oriented research and recognize that much of our research is actually geared towards change. And we should acknowledge and embrace how values are shaping our approach to science. and recognize that that's actually what allows us to bring our full selves to our research. Because I'm sure many of you got into science because you do want to see some change in the world. Something doesn't feel right to you, and you want to see it different. And so by doing this, this actually enables us to address the most pressing problems of our time while still maintaining the open curiosity that is necessary for quality inquiry. A great example of this is a social justice orientation that attends to histories and ongoing sites of oppression can actually lead to deeper and real change. Before the activist organization ACT UP began its work and research, uh, there was virtually no research or attention to the many men dying of AIDS and many people dying of AIDS. There was no research being done to save those lives. Today, because of the research they did and they started, we now have people who are HIV positive living full lives, and we're seeing the potential for full recovery. Now, the last pairing will be control, hierarchy, and power, um, as opposed to a model of correlation. So I'll be honest, there's kind of two things packed in here, so I'll break them out separately. First, control. Control, when I talk about control, I'm talking about having control groups. We can start there. In most experiments, we often want to have controlled conditions. We want to have a control group, an experimental group. And this is a really important model of research that I think we need to keep. And we also recognize that the way that that setup is not actually representative of our own lived experience or the way things, you could say, actually work in the world. The whole point of that model is to give us a very, very narrow slice of reality so that we can establish with some certainty. And again, very important methodology, but also only provides partial perspective, to borrow from a previous pairing. So so this this model of using controls, I think, also relates to concepts of hierarchy and power. Research that has control, that follows a model of controls with limited variables, is tended to be seen as more legitimate. This is part of a hierarchy of knowledge, and this is a way that power is often deployed in scientific research. So as an alternative, and I'd say in this one more than any others, like I think this is one where, you know, we kind of just continue to hold on to both to an extent. But what's important to recognize is that models, research that study correlation, are just as important as models that study in a more controlled fashion. The theories that correlation can produce can give us different insights and actually represent a more accurate representation of reality, even if it does contain elements of subjectivity, elements that may be challenged with different interpretations. That's the whole point. That actually represents the conditions in which we live. This allows us to examine how complex systems interact with each other, and it makes space for ambiguity and not knowing, and these are, frankly, the conditions under which we live. So we have 4 pairs here. I invite you all to reflect on which pair resonates with you the most. And I'm also going to ask you to, if you don't mind, sharing in a poll which one resonates with you the most. And I would like to share this just if with you all so you can see where others are falling. And I'm also sharing a link with you all in the chat if you want to read more. And so what I would invite you all to do after this is take that pair, reflect on it more. And if you do engage in discussion, that can be a starting place to sort of first discuss, like, why that pair? Why did you choose that to start? I'm going to go ahead and end this poll so you can all see we have I think, a nice a nice breakout between um, different pairings, value neutrality and change oriented resonating the most, which I think makes a lot of sense as we're in a moment when the need for different types of change in our world, whether it's climate change or moving towards racial justice, are all things that I think we can see as needs that science can help to address. So thank you all for sharing that. Now, as we close out, I will offer some provocations for those of you that are going to engage in further discussion. So one, how do you understand the pair that you chose? And what tensions do you see between these two versions of objectivity? And then you can think about, how did you see the pair you choose operating in your field? So what are the sort of specific examples that that pair evokes for you? Three, can you think of times when you have seen objectivity used in a way to assert power, to quote, put someone in their place, to dominate, to shut down a line of inquiry, to assert status, etc.? And how does power operate differently in these different pairs? I think that we can probably all think of moments, whether in our professional or our personal lives, when, say, an attachment to emotion or being emotional was used as a way to shut someone down. Um, Four, how does redefining objectivity offer an inroads into integrating new perspectives and creating new scientific insights? So, with those questions, I hope that you are all able to have some productive discussions. Next week, we will be back discussing legacies of colonialism. I also want to remind you all that the previous sessions now are all, excepting today's, are now all on the Feminist Research Institute's YouTube channel. And so if you missed one, you want to check it out, you want to share it with colleagues or friends, or you just want to revisit a session, please do. Well, I wish you all a wonderful break. Hopefully, we'll all be staying in, not unfortunately, probably not seeing as many of our loved ones as we'd like, but hopefully all staying safe. Okay, thank you all.